And this week, I want to talk a little bit about Deleuze and Guattari. Well, actually, to be honest, I'm mainly going to talk about Guattari, but Deleuze and Guattari, these are the names of these terrible theorists who are super trendy and people use all over the place for all sorts of things, doing weird shit with them, often incomprehensible weird shit. But on the other hand, they're also focus of my research, and have been for God knows how long now. My doctoral work, which I finished in 2005, so I've been going on before then, was on Deleuze, and since then I've studied Guattari a lot more. So that's the kind of sort of subject matter today. In fact, what we're going to be talking about is a concept called the abstract machine. And I'm very tired today. It's been a warm and stuffy old day, and I've been sort of making notes and writing out stuff about the abstract machine all day, and it's definitely not the easiest thing to get your head around. So I'm going to take it easy today, and this might go a bit slower, therefore. But we'll see. I still think it's going to go too fast. But anyway. So in many ways, the project that we're looking at here, the Earth is a Freudian Spaceship, is best understood as being located within schizoanalysis. And in fact, the self-description we offer is that we're thinking a Fanonian schizoanalysis. So a schizoanalysis with Fanon with as an adjective on this. So the whole of the schizoanalytic practice is rethought or re-encountered through Fanon, as it were, and through beginning with a kind of what Guattari would probably call an ethico-aesthetic relationship to Fanon's concepts, Fanon's writing, Fanon's thinking, Fanon's actions. And so the self-description we offer is that we're thinking a kind of Fanonian schizoanalysis, one where what we call the wretched of the earth, or what Fanon called the wretched of the earth, are thought entwined with the wretched earth. And so one where the voices, the revolutionary in Fanon or in Guattari, for example, are in chorus, where they're resonant and vibrant. And so it's a lot to do with this bringing together, to try and see what resonance is, what vibrations, what kind of amplifications occur in that connection. Now, there's still the question that's been raised in the seminar quite reasonably and elsewhere, and the one that always is faced with this kind of sort of theoretical work, I suppose, which is, what difference does this thinking make? In bringing these things together, what's kind of the process of difference that you're trying to produce? What different concepts, what different lines of thinking, what different ways of working? What's the difference? Does a particular way of thinking, particularly when the mode of thinking is one in which the rational intellect is no longer master. I mean, and that's clearly the case in a sense with Freud and with Deleuze and Guattari. I'm not going to say that's the case with Fanon. I think there's something else going on in Fanon's work, but maybe we'll come back to that. So what difference does this kind of thinking make? And one of the components of an answer is going to come from the idea of abstract machines. And this peculiar idea of abstract machines. So this is what I want to kind of talk about today. And try and sort of focus on the kind of differences that this particular way of thinking, this particular concept, to try and focus on some of the differences that this concept can enable us to introduce into the way we think the world, the way we understand the world, the way we relate to the world. So in the first chapter of Guattari's book, Chaosmosis, an ethico-aesthetic paradigm, which is one of the parts of which was the reading for this week, with a section from Anti-Oedipus and the first chapter of Chaosmosis. In that first chapter, Guattari makes clear that the idea of an abstract machine derives from what he calls a brilliant intuition from the linguist Helmschlev. Probably pronounced that wrong. It's a very curious word, Helmschlev. I'll put it into the chat. This is let's just put it into the chat. It's a very curious word. This is the guy's name. I think it's Jacob Helmschlev, and he's a peculiar linguist who builds on the work of someone called Ferdinand Saussure, and builds a very formal kind of structure on top of this. So it's a kind of odd place that you might think of getting something, Deleuze and Guattari, all becomings and flows. It might seem an odd place together because it's very formal looking work, by which I mean it's like, it almost looks like a kind of mathematics. But Guattari says that there's this brilliant intuition that he finds in this particular linguist, and that they develop in Anti-Oedipus, but they develop most explicitly for the first time really in the book A Thousand Plateaus. Now, this brilliant intuition is to do with the relationship of form, and it kind of is going to be this peculiar relationship to form that the abstract machine is meant to kind of articulate. But it's also clear that the role of the abstract machine as found in linguistics, Guattari thinks, is to be expanded, to be pushed out beyond the domain of language into what he calls the extra-linguistic, this is to quote Guattari, into the extra-linguistic, non-human, biological, technological, aesthetic, etc. You can find this on page 24 of that first chapter of Cosmosis. So we're taking something from a very, very strange formalistic linguist who's studying signs and symbols, meaning and language and all these kind of things, but doing so in a really very kind of abstracted way. And we're trying to sort of take some intuition from this situation and then draw it out of the linguistic domain and make it apply, as he says, extra-linguistic, non-human, biological, technological, aesthetic. I mean, this looks like it's meant to apply everywhere, and the little etc. there kind of helps, indicate that. And then Guattari, who's himself, obviously, Guattari has this kind of interesting way of writing. We'll talk about that in a moment. Guattari then carries on, and there's a little quote. He tries to explain. Let's say what he's going to do with this intuition. I'm going to put this quote in the chat as well. Now I think, there we go. There we go. That's Guattari. That comes up, and that saves me having to make a PowerPoint. Sorry, I was knackered today, so I didn't make a PowerPoint with the quotes. Anyway, so this is Guattari. The problem of the enunciative assemblage would then no longer be specific to a semiotic register, but would traverse an ensemble of heterogeneous expressive materials. So if we can find this intuition in this formal, structure of language that is not just applicable to language, then we can kind of enable, this is the idea, enable a lot more than just words to have a voice, if you like. So we're taking this intuition, we're taking it out of the linguistic domain, and in that situation, as I say, the problem of the enunciative assemblage would then no longer be specific to a semiotic register. In other words, we've taken it out of the linguistic domain, but would traverse an ensemble of heterogeneous expressive materials. That's a very posh way of sort of saying would cover a lot more ground. And apply to a lot more things. He goes on. Thus, a transversality between enunciative substances, which can be, on one hand, linguistic, but on the other, of a machinic order, developing from non-semiotically formed matter, to use another of Helmschlev's expressions. So, transversality, that's a kind of curious one. So imagine two different lines that are going down, there's two different kind of lines, and a transversality is one that's going to cut across, connecting up those two things. It's going to be like a cut across. And so a transversality is going to enable different domains to be able to sort of speak and connect to each other, or to be able to have some sort of relationship with each other. But also what's interesting there is a transversality, he says, between enunciative substance, which can be on the one hand linguistic, so things that we can talk about, that we can put into words, but on the other of a machinic order. Now, what do we mean by this? Or what's Guattari kind of mean by this machinic order? This is one of the things referred to by the machinic order is one in which the idea of intention doesn't have to be there. The idea of meaning doesn't have to be there for something to be productive. And so there's this kind of automatism or autonomic system. There's this kind of automatic process within a machinic order, in a sense. And it's trying to enable the kind of discussion between or the connection between that which is sort of the domain of meaning and that which is the domain of something that's, as it were, a blind process. That's something sometimes people say about automatic or natural processes. Now, that sentence, these couple of sentences immediately drop us into that strange world that I referred to just now, Guattari's schizoanalytic cartographies. It's another wonderfully strange phrase. So schizoanalysis is just the kind of mode of analysis. Instead of psychoanalysis, it's an analysis of the kind of breaks and the flows, the schizes. And cartographies are two techniques of mapping. So Guattari employs this way of trying to map the flows and the breaks by using the map making itself as a kind of crucial process. So continuously making and remaking maps, remaking diagrams, trying to continuously sort of reorder and rework and refine the relationship to the world. And in Guattari's strange world, there's this intense jargon or complexity quite often. There's a swirl of concepts, connections and strange words, but there's a strange dynamic that can be sensed, I think, through the vast majority of Guattari's work, and which I think is the one that needs to be kind of like really focused on. And so amidst all the swirl of concepts and connections and strange words and this strange dynamic can be sensed, one in which the world itself speaks. Or something like that. I mean, okay. So, I'm going to put that forward there and immediately kind of pull it back again. But that idea of somehow the world itself speaking, or the world itself expressing itself, the expression of the universe, the expression of the world. Now, these things, they're really difficult because obviously they drop us very quickly if we're not careful into some sort of mysticism where we're putting another godlike figure out there that's really doing the thinking, and I'm just the dream in a dreamer's mind, and all these kind of strange things. And so I become passive again in relationship to something that's active. But that's not. I think that's kind of part of the issue that Guattari is coping with, not enabling a kind of replication of passivity. And again, we'll come back to this passivity. So the strange jargon, that kind of curious, intense sort of swirl of concepts, connections, and strange words. All of these things that are there in Guattari, and which make him very difficult to read. There's no doubt about that. But they're there, as I say, as part of this continuous process to try and rethink, rework, to try and remap the world around and the flows and breaks of the world around. Let's just focus here on that passage, just for a little bit. Let's just try and work through this passage. First of all, the problem of enunciative assemblages. Let's begin there. To enunciate, to speak well, to enunciate your words. We kind of know what enunciation means. This kind of mode of speaking. So think here, when we think about enunciation, and particularly when we think of an enunciative assemblage, think of the way an accent, for example, is so often a component of speech. At the moment, I'm sort of interested in following this group called Working Class Academics, who are running a conference in July, and one of the things that encounters there is an accent that working class people bring into the situations that they live in, which in some situations is kind of a positive identification and a binding kind of connection mode, and in other situations is a kind of separation mode. And in academia that's the case, and obviously similar experiences are encountered by people from different ethnic backgrounds, people with different cultural backgrounds. these are elements of the words as much as the words themselves in terms of an enunciative assemblage. It's not just, as it were, what someone means in the abstract. It's the whole kind of set of connections that enable that speech to take place. Or just think of the mouth. Its formation and function, the throat, the lungs, the diaphragm. At which point, of course, we can think of breath and breathing, which is a central theme to our work, and the way these operate. So, if you're an actor or you're training yourself in public speaking, then, or maybe you have a speech difference that you're trying to sort of shift for some reason. Then you might think of, and you might bring to bear your consciousness on the shapes of the mouth, the way in which the throat operates, that movement up and down of the diaphragm, when to breathe and when not to. Or think of rhythm, connotation, association, the kind of things that we might encounter in poetry. These are also part of an enunciative assemblage. Or power, a judge handing down a sentence, a word within a specific frame of power. The word only sort of, as it were, is itself, not because of some specific meaning, but in sense partly because of the whole enunciative assemblage that it's part of. Detention, shouts the teacher, but no one's going to listen if it's a school holiday. If they're just shouting it randomly. Has to be in the right space, in the right context, with the right action that it's a response to. Or there's the famous example in philosophy of someone shouting fire. So this often is connected to notions of the limits of freedom of expression. So the argument would be that it makes a difference when you shout fire in a crowded cinema. Which it's true from saying it outside or in a situation in which it's not going to immediately make people respond, like get away from the fire and possibly stampede each other. So there's that example that is there in philosophy, and that it sort of recognises these notions of something like an enunciative assemblage in terms of as I say, the limits of or freedoms of speech. And it makes a difference whether we shout fire in a crowded cinema or perhaps when it's on a firing line as the enemy approaches. These things take on completely different shapes and different forms. There are different assemblages in those different situations. And so that's what we mean by an enunciative assemblage, the kind of it's a way, in some sense, of talking about context, but it is also a way of us having, as it were, the right components of our assemblage, thinking about what elements matter. So as I say, if you're thinking about public speaking, then perhaps the mouth and the diaphragm might matter, breath and breathing. If you're thinking about poetry, it might be rhythm, connotation, association, something like that. So the assemblage is always a shifting and kind of, in a sense, the way in which we encounter context. They're not the same as, but they're the way in which we encounter context, the elements that are involved. So if we refer to something like the problem of the enunciative assemblage, then that problem is basically the problem of how that which speaks is able to do what it does. Okay, so what we're looking at is this capacity to do what it does, the capacity of the function of the assemblage to enunciate, to speak well, to enunciate your words, as we said. And so the functioning of the enunciative assemblage, how it learns to do what it does, how the functions operate in practice, how we work out what minor components make up the major assemblage, all these questions and more form that thing that we've called the problem of the enunciative assemblage. How that which speaks is able to do what it does. So within Guattari's account in that first chapter of Chaosmosis, from which this quote is coming, he's specifically looking at the relationship between subject and object, which is very traditional philosophical territory in many ways. So in a large measure, the problem of the enunciative assemblage is approached via the ways in which the relation of an object to a subject develop. And that's specific to that chapter. That's not always how we pose this. But this is also in this first chapter where we find Guattari's emphasis on what he calls the productions of subjectivity. And in the context in which we're reading it here, it can be very easy to slip back into the human a little too quickly at this point. So a word of caution. The schizoanalytic framework takes language to be only one situation within a wider context of non-linguistic enunciative assemblages. Now that's kind of important. So language doesn't give us a model, rather something else needs to be, as it were, the kind of framework in which we think of enunciation. And this is kind of crucial, that we don't, as we almost inevitably can't help doing, that we don't overwrite the way things work with the end result, which is, in our case, the use of language. And we don't, this is a word of caution that must be kind of constantly kept in mind, is that the schizoanalytic framework takes language to be only one situation within that wider context of non-linguistic enunciative assemblages. In other words, things, if you like, crudely put, speak, and the fact that speaking takes place, is as it were a result of the fact that things speak or things express, and by things we mean what exactly? I think we want to push this thought of things expressing almost as far as we can. So this is one, in some sense, we talk about signs of the times, talking in terms of the earth. Anyway, we'll come back again. We'll cycle around to some of these things again and again, I expect. But let's just go. Let's just refer a little bit to Guattari, who says something sort of slightly earlier from the passage I've just cited, just to sort of confirm this, to show this kind of situating language within non-linguistic enunciative assemblages. This is Guattari. We would like to resituate semiology within the scope of an expanded machinic conception, which would free us from a simple linguistic opposition between expression and content, and allow us to integrate into enunciative assemblages an indefinite number of substances of expression, such as biological codings or organisational forms belonging to the socius. Okay, that's again a kind of complicated. I'm going to again pop that into the chat, just so people can see it there. The chat looks mad now, I imagine. That's completely barking, but that's very amusing. Okay. Obviously this... Why does he want to do this? Why does he, there's a whole bunch of things that are going on. What is he talking about when he talks about an indefinite number of substances of expression? Why has he got this expression content? What's going on here? So let's, again, slowly work our way through. Notice the way that the desire in this passage is to be freed up. Okay, we would like to resituate semiology within the scope of an expanded machinic conception, which would free us from a simple linguistic opposition. Okay, so there's that even if you're not entirely clear, you can sort of situate this either of a simple linguistic opposition that is kind of the enemy, and a machinic conception that somehow is going to free you up from that. Quite how? And it's an expanded machinic conception as well, so that's, but even so, we can begin to get a sense of that dynamic between simple linguistic opposition and an expanded machinic conception. The strategic argument here, which is this freeing up, it arises from the aim of freeing. It's a way of understanding language distinct from this simple linguistic opposition. But there are two kind of questions that kind of come up, which is, why would you want to do this, and how do you think you're going to do it? And these two issues are quite distinct in many ways, but the abstract machine is part of the how. Okay, so in a sense, one of the things that the abstract machine aims to do, obviously it's using language to do this, and it's using expression in language to do this, but one of the things it aims to do is to be a key strategic kind of concept that enables us to break out of as it were, simple linguistic oppositions. Simple linguistic oppositions between, words and the things they apply to, or, things we mean and the way in which the things we mean are kind of expressed. Simple linguistic oppositions that are always within language. So the abstract machine is going to be part of the how that we enable to sort of, break out of that opposition. But before we get onto that, we might want to pay some attention to that why. Why do you want to get out of this simple linguistic opposition? What's the problem here? Right. I'm gonna it's 20. Yeah, so we're gonna carry on for a little bit, but I'm just trying to slow down. What I'm gonna do next is just to sort of slow things down a little bit, is just to share a very simple diagram, and then we'll come back to this why and how we want to get out of the simple linguistic oppositions. So I'm just going to share in fact, maybe I wonder if we can get this down some other way. I'm trying to think what's the best way of you being able to actually see it. No. Okay, so here we are. Let's move this around a bit. Right. That's not the best, is it? Right, so this is just a small diagram. And what we're trying to do here is, so this model has come out of Helmsleb from talking about language and the way in which language works, linguistics. And Guattari is trying to use a kind of what he calls this brilliant intuition about abstract machines to enable the model to sort of be reconstituted more generally, so that it would apply to biology, it would apply to things that come up in the socius, it would apply to a much wider range of situations, and still talk about or think of them through this kind of model that has come, in a sense, out of language, but has now been expanded and has been shifted and moved. So this is the kind of strategic, so it's a kind of curious thing he wants to do. And the model that he's using from Helmsleb, and this is what this diagram is intended to kind of like point to. So let's call the whole of this kind of box the enunciative assemblage, if you like. And at the heart of this box, at the heart of this space, is this abstract machine. Sometimes, and I think this is a great way of thinking about the abstract machine, sometimes it's called the refrain, and they're pretty much exactly the same thing. I think there is a bit of a difference that I must admit I'm not going to even think about trying to unpack at the moment, but basically we can think of these as the same thing, the abstract machine and the refrain, the way in which the word refrain is used. And this abstract machine or refrain is at the heart of things. It's the nuclei of an enunciative assemblage, and it forms at first this kind of what's called the form of content and the form of expression, and only then does it produce a kind of substance of content and a substance of expression. Now, what we encounter in language, what we encounter with a sign, or what we encounter when we respond to the world around us, are the stuff here at the edges, if you like, the substances of contents and expression. But at the heart of this, the organising structure, are these forms of content and forms of expression, and they themselves are kind of brought into being through the nuclei of the abstract machine. So that's the kind of very basic kind of model that he's operating here. And what we want to do, or what Guattari wants to do, is this abstract machine at the heart, this refrain that is, as it were, crystallizes and puts a particular kind of common form onto both a content and expression, and then onto a substance of content and expression. What he wants to do is enable that abstract machine not to be solely the result of, as it were, conscious or unconscious intentionality, not solely the result of something that a human means about the world or a human means to say. Rather, these things can occur famously, as it were, between a wasp and an orchid, in which there's a kind of connection between different processes, biological process, for example, in that situation, or they can occur inside the socius, or they can occur inside information systems. There's a whole range in which these things occur almost, as it were, automatically in this machinic notion. Okay, this is why it's an abstract machine. It begins to make a process kind of operate. So yeah, that's we're just going to take a moment there. So just have a glance at that sort of diagram there. Okay, so let's wander back to where we were. So what we found is that Guattari wants to engage in this kind of strategic move to break us out of language. He's taking, however, a lesson from something within a linguistic theorist's work, and using that in order to then sort of enable this strategy of breaking outside of language, going beyond language, not being caught in linguistic oppositions. So that's the basic strategy, and that's what the abstract machine is doing in this basic strategy. That's its role. It's kind of the role, it's the means by which we're going to break out of the linguistic oppositions. And so the questions that we want to ask about this are, in a sense, how? Well, you're going to do it with the abstract machine. We'll fill the details of that in a little bit more maybe later. So, okay, you're going to break out of language using the abstract machine, but why? Why do you want to do this? What's the issue? What's the problem? And here the guiding question, of why, in a sense, we want to. I'm going to try and put it in a slightly strange way. So, the guiding question as to why, in a sense, we want to break out of linguistic oppositions is because it's something like who is speaking. And the way in which this question should be heard is important, however. It should be contrasted, for example, or at least put in tension with the question, what is speaking? Okay, so there are two different questions here. Who is speaking? What is speaking? And now, what is speaking? For example, that might enable us to see that there are other forces at work in expression. So these forces are speaking, they're kind of expressing themselves through an individual's work, through an individual's writing, through an individual's thought. And so what is speaking? We might be talking about forces such as the unconscious, Freud, or forces such as the racialized value system of colonialism, as in Fanon. And so, for example, might we say that, if we're following this line of thought, might we say that in Fanon, what is speaking in, for example, the black man's experience, the chapter as he describes it in Black Skin, White Masks, might we say that what is speaking is both racism, in other words, that value system of racism in which the black man is inferior, but also the resistance to that value system that expresses something named as human. Okay, so that's what's speaking. It's not just... it's not just one of the forces. It's the relationship or the tension there as well. So there's another thing that's also being expressed in order for that tension to as it were, be operable. So there are two different drives or dynamics in tension. So when we talk about what is speaking there, it's important to kind of notice that it's not simply a one-way sort of a one-way dynamic in which there's a fundamental force that's speaking, but in fact quite often when we speak about forces there's tensions that we're actually speaking about. So we're talking about more than one. We're talking about a plurality of things that have established particular tensions. But even so, it still seems a little odd. What's speaking is this kind of, sure, what's speaking through Fanon is both the racism he's encountered and the resistance to racism. Both the value system of racism in which the black man is inferior as he describes it, and the resistance to this that he's trying to articulate. But who is speaking? If we ask that, then we have a different kind of response, because it's Fanon himself. It's not some structure, it's not some training, it's not even some biography, but nonetheless it is Fanon who speaks here, or part of Fanon at the very least. So who is speaking? Now there's a key formula that can be found all over the place when it comes to psychoanalysis, and it goes something like this: the subject of psychoanalysis is the subject of transference. So let's think just for a moment about that analytical model of the unconscious drive. I touched upon it last week. And so there is in Freud this basic tension between id and ego that I described last week as a kind of domestication model. An unruly free energy organised into a coherency over time by its relations with the self-conscious ego. So this is a kind of self-organising process. There's no strict architect at hand. Rather, there's a set of major factors and their interactions. Id, ego, pleasure, sociality. Things like that. So self-organisation takes place. Subjects form personalities, if you like, but within a system of effectively pre-established factors. We assume certain things, such as the free energy of the id, for example, or the restrictive nature of the social, and then we work out our kind of causal narrative from these different factors. And accidental factors, trauma, for example, impact as something like external forces. So we've got quite a rich set of characters to form a story with. The idiosyncrasies of a particular individual can be accommodated as kind of like tones or colours within a basic plot line. And yet the plot line has to be assumed. Okay, the story is already told, just not the details of the moments in the story. So in the process of analysis, what is speaking is less the details, the manifest content that we encounter in the words, actions and emotions of an individual, and it's more the plot point of the story itself, the latent content, as the psychoanalysts might refer to it. And transference is the process by which the conversation in the analysis is recognised as expressing not just the people sitting in the room, but the characters that accompany the individuals. The past, the story so far. Transference is the moment when the refrain from another character is expressed in the words or actions of the therapist. In more Jungian language, we might find the sense of projection and archetype. And there's a sense in which transference and projection are trying to think something very similar. But often these transferential relations are encountered through feeling. I feel like this is what my mother says, or something like that. What speaks then? What speaks for psychoanalysis is the past. The way the body and thought connected, the way a word or object was felt. The past overcodes the present and the future. What speaks is the past, not the future. And how would we even be able to hear the future? And perhaps this speaks to the why of the abstract machine. So the abstract machine is the core of an assemblage. It's nuclei, as I've mentioned. Guattari often compares abstract machines with universals or with abstractions. And yet the comparison should be thought of and heard as disjunctive, one of comparison and distinction. So the abstract machine is different from the universal or the abstraction in that it opens, that it offers an open rather than a closed form of consistency. This is going to be the crucial point, this open rather than closed form of consistency. Now, I mean, that's no doubt an odd phrase, okay? A form of consistency. But for now, let's just think of this in terms of something like that which enables us to take an object as an object. So out of the various different elements and moments that make up a tree, for example, there is some kind of consistency that brings them together as the tree, like this tree. This binding together, this is a coming to consistency, a coming together or a being taken together. If we're thinking of trees, or famously in philosophy, we end up thinking of tables a lot. So if we're thinking of trees or tables, we might talk about an idea or a form or even a concept of the tree, some abstraction that operates as a way of bringing together various specific things. Now, the abstraction or the universal has been a long-standing strategy in philosophy. It goes all the way back to Plato. And it's been a long-standing strategy in philosophy to understand difference and diversity alongside sameness and unity. How are all these different trees still trees? What makes this tree and that tree a tree? This one's tall and pointy, this one's short and dumpy, all these kind of things. Now, traditionally, we have a name for those who think such things as universals exist. So they think that there is a form or a concept or an idea somewhere, and it exists, and that's how we can kind of recognise, these specific things, or specific trees, as kind of, the same, as it were. So those, traditionally we have those who think such things as universals exist, and those who think they don't. And those who think they don't exist think it's all in a name. One of the reasons the opponents of universals are called nominalists. Now, the disagreement is around a particular question, in a sense. The disagreement is around whether the question of whether universals exist or not. Are they needed? Are they, as it were, out there? For the universalist, the problem is one of explaining where this out there is. They can explain how we bind things together, making a unity out of diversity with the abstraction, but they have to assume something like a special realm of universals. And mostly they don't want to go fully Platonist and declare that there's a realm of forms, eternal and shining bright. But on the other hand, the nominalist doesn't need a special realm of abstractions that we have access to. They can rest on the fact that we just happen to call some things by the same name. But the problem then is that these names are pretty arbitrarily applied, and so we've got no real grounds other than habit for thinking that there's a consistency between various things we think of as trees. In both cases, however, there's an inbuilt passivity here. We either recognize universals that already exist, or we submit to habits of naming things, habits that already exist. Again, the past dominates the present. The form of consistency using universals is thus a mode of passivity. And now this is why, or this is the why, if you like, of the abstract machine, to produce an open form of consistency as opposed to a closed form, one that can be active rather than passive, one that still can be creative rather than just oppressive. Now, one of the reasons for this openness is the abstract machine organises the past as much as it does the future. And this is where we're going to kind of close a little bit tonight, because this takes us into other territory. One of the things that the abstract machine does, as I say, is it organises the past as much as the future. So it can't be an imposition of a past, because it's organising that past. But this means that something like retroactive causation is being suggested. Retroactive causation, is a really strange concept. It's the idea that if I make something now, it can sort of retroactively, fold back in time and somehow have a causal effect. And that just seems weird. It makes me think of Star Trek's, time travel paradoxes and grandfather paradoxes, all sorts of weird stuff that occur when you start, not taking time as a linear thing. But let's avoid this for the time being. Okay, let's just avoid this for the time being. Yes, there's a big issue there. It's worth thinking about. It's worth talking about. At the moment, let's not worry too much about it. It's just look at a little bit, of as it were, what this point of the abstract machine and its role in relationship to consistency is. So that if the why is that we have this open form of consistency rather than a closed form, the how is that the abstract machine produces consistency without causality. And this is kind of the interesting thing about it. It produces consistency without causality. And it does so in part because causality arises from the consistency it produces. So consistency itself arises from something like a binding together of forms. This is why Guattari was so fascinated, I think, with the way Helmsleb had his four concepts: expression, content, and substance form, because it meant that at some point there was a common formal moment that could be posed as the moment of constitutive consistency. I will say that again. The common formal moment that could be posed as the moment of constitutive consistency. In other words, the moment at which consistency is constituted. Okay, there's a kind of before and an after, and there's a kind of moment at which that constitution takes place, like a crystallization moment. And this common formal moment, where there's a common form of both content and a common form of expression, sort of that are kind of the first moments of consistency. That common formal moment is what's named by the abstract machine, or the refrain. And so once there's this common formal moment that can be posed as the moment of constitutive consistency of both form of content and form of expression, it's important that those themselves produce substances of expression, substances of content, and Here what we establish is a common productive space of forms, or rather of consistencies, because we don't need to talk too much about forms now. We're more concerned or more interested in these consistencies. But we find, or at least what an abstract machine for Guattari does, is reveal a common productive space of these consistencies. And what's important in this is that this is what's being embraced in Freud in terms of desire, and in Marx in terms of labour. This common productive space of consistencies. Okay, so this, in a sense, the ways in which desire operates, the desire and the drives operate in Freud, is not really, what's crucial about it is not the Oedipal relationships that are, or the particular consistencies, if you like, that have been formed according to Freud in his particular mytho-poetic kind of way of describing things, but the fact that consistencies can be formed in the first place. And again, for Marx, one of the things that's crucial there is not just the fact that he describes a particular form of consistency, a particular form, if you like, of way things are kind of brought together when it comes to labour, but he's also describing for Deleuze and Guattari this fact that such things can take place. And so in both situations, what's really interesting for them, I think, or what's pushing them to make these kind of analogies is what they think of as the discovery of these common productive spaces. Common productive spaces, as I've said, of expression, of desire, and of labour. And these are pretty big chunks, that cover a pretty wide range of things. Now this is all to kind of point to very small, if you like, very detailed elements inside Deleuze and Guattari's sort of theoretical work, and in particular inside Guattari's. The abstract machine is a kind of quite detailed moment, but it also points, I think, crucially to let's say the different mode of using abstractions, or the different mode of using the abstract, and obviously that has a huge impact for the way in which we might want to sort of think of theoretical work taking place, something along those lines. Now what I want to do, I think, is probably just leave it there, because I don't want to add anything else at the moment that might just complicate things, and there's going to be conversation in the seminar. I just want to re-emphasize as the kind of last moment for that, before I begin to go and open those, this notion of the making of consistency, the production of consistency, and that this is a really crucial problem here that's trying to be rethought.